Hello students, welcome again. Students, in today's lecture, we want to understand Philip Larkin's contribution to English poetry during the second half of the 20th century. Philip Larkin has been considered as the leader of movement poetry. So today, we will understand what this movement poetry is, and we will also try to analyze and appreciate Philip Larkin as an anti-modernist poet of English literature. So now let's begin. Philip Larkin is a distinguished poet, a distinguished leader of movement poetry during the second half of the 20th century. He has published two novels, 4 volumes of poetry, and several critical essays on jazz music. Many critics have appreciated him as a great poet of the 20th century. One among them, Alan Brown John, according to him, his poetry is full of clarity and simplicity. There is no pomp and show in Larkin's poetry. His poetry is most technically brilliant and resonantly beautiful and profoundly disturbing, yet it is appealing to the mind and heart of the readers. And he said that the body of the verse of any English poet in the last 25 years can never be compared with Philip Larkin. So this was the high stature of Philip Larkin as a poet in 1950s and 60s. As I told you, he is mainly known by his 2 novels, Jill and A Girl in Winter, and he is also more known as a poet, not as a novelist. And as a poet, he has published 4 big volumes of hundreds of poems collected in these 4 volumes, and these are the North Ship, The Less Deceived, The Whitsun Weddings, and High Windows. Okay, so it is through these 4 volumes of poetry that we come to know about his great contribution to English literature. Now, if you read different critiques of Philip Larkin, now these critiques are generally categorized into 2 different groups. Okay, the first group of critics believes that Larkin is a modern poet, and another group believes that he is an anti-modern poet and he is the leader of movement poetry. But majority of the critics go in this line by saying that he is the true anti-modernist and he is the true leader of movement poetry. Now the question that comes before us is what this movement poetry is. And I have already uploaded my previous video on movement poetry, on the features of movement poetry. You must watch that first of all before understanding this Philip Larkin's contribution. But I am repeating here, this term modern poetry was coined by J.D. Scott in 1954. Okay, and it was in 1950s and 60s, this movement poetry picked up and became so much popular. Okay, it was a reaction against the earlier poetry of the 1920s, 30s and 40s, which was popularized by T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Dylan Thomas and so many others. Okay, so there is a contrast. 1920s and 30s you have Eliot, Ezra Pound and others. Their poetry is known as modern poetry. But if you come to 1950s and 60s, it is a reaction against that modern poetry of Eliot and Ezra Pound. Okay, sorry. Now, what are the important features of this movement poetry? As I told you, it is a reaction against the Eliot's poetry of modern age, 1920s, 1930s. At the same time, this movement poetry is also a reaction against the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Remember William Wordsworth, too much romanticism is also reacted here in 1950s and 60s. Here, the focus in movement poetry, the focus is more on harsh naked realism of the modern man's life after the Second World War. Okay, here you do not find that the poets are lamenting over the loss of the glory of human life. No lamenting, they accept life as it is. Though it is full of isolation, though it is full of frustration and suffering, but the movement poets accepted it and presented this realism in their poetry. Moreover, as far as meter, as far as rhyming pattern is concerned, these movement poets, they followed the traditional style of the 17th, 18th and 19th century poets. Okay, so in a way they are the followers of the traditional poetry, and in a way they are also going against the 1920s and 30s poets. Why? Because if you read Eliot, Dylan Thomas, Sylvia Plath, you find that they are writing in free verse. Okay, so movement poetry is a reaction against that free verse. Here they are writing poetry in proper metrical rhythm. Okay, moreover, in 1920s and 30s you find too much experimentation in poetry. Here no experimentation. Okay, traditional forms of poetry have been adopted without doing so much innovation, so many innovations. Okay, here the focus is more on simplicity of expression, no figurative language. Sometimes the poets make use of highly figurative languages, like they use simile, metaphor, apostrophe and so many others. Here it is clear movement poetry is away from those figures of speech. No allusions, no references to the mythology. You read T.S. Eliot, what do you see? In T.S. Eliot's poetry, you have mythology, you have references to the Bible, you have references to some Indian philosophies, but here in movement poetry of 1950s and 60s, no mythologies, no philosophy of the ancient times, and the language, the diction which is used by the poet is highly simple and colloquial. Colloquial means the day-to-day conversation, the language that a common man uses. That same common language has been taken up by these movement poets. Okay, now let's try to examine how Philip Larkin was a leader of this movement. For that you need to examine Larkin's poetry. So the first important thing which makes him a movement poet is his simplicity of expression, clarity, and his simple style, colloquial language. Okay, colloquial language, I told you, simple language of the people. Pearl K. Bell is an important critique of Philip Larkin. According to him, in all the poems of Philip Larkin, there is a lucidity of language. Means the language flows so freely, so easily, just like a brook coming down from the mountain. Okay, so language is going on very freely and in a smooth flow. So the lucidity of language, which invites the understanding even when the ideas are expressed in a paradoxical and a complex manner. Sometimes Philip Larkin has presented some paradoxical ideas. No doubt, ideas are paradoxical, opposite ideas, but the language is easy to understand, and that's the reason why his ideas are also clearly expressed by him. Let me give you some examples from his poetry. One of his very popular poems, Talking in Bed, this is a nice example of simplicity and clarity of language. Here the language is very much straightforward. Okay, the subject matter of this poem is very much ironic, the relationship between nature and people, nature and man. Okay, but the language is clear and there is no ambiguity found in this poem. Ambiguity is one of the important characteristics of modern poetry, and this movement poetry is a reaction against modern poetry. So here in movement poetry you do not find any ambiguity. Another poem, Mr. Blinley, if you read this poem, okay, Here also he has written the poem in a simple and colloquial language. Okay, it has clarity and it is self-explanatory. You do not need any reviewer, any critic to explain the poem, explain the thought of the poem. Okay, and there are no far-fetched images of the metaphysical poets, of the modern poets, no mysticism, and that makes him his poetry simple poetry, clear and straightforward poetry, which is one of the major features of movement poetry. Another important feature of movement poetry is realism. Okay, so you find this element of realism in Philip Larkin's poetry. If you read these poems like Faith Healing, like Dockery and the Sun, like Water, High Windows, Sad Steps, in all these poems, you see a touch of realism, which is the important major feature of this movement poetry. What are the important themes presented by him? Like you see, the themes are death, religion, fear, terror, isolation. Okay, these are some common themes on which he has written poetry, and these are the themes which are related to realism. Okay, Peter King, who is an important critic of Philip Larkin's poetry, he comments that a close reading of Hardy taught Larkin that a modern poet could write about the life around him in the language of the society around him. Now, let me tell you, Philip Larkin was much influenced by Thomas Hardy. He used to read Hardy's novels, Hardy's works, Hardy's short stories and poems. Okay, and because he was influenced by Hardy's contribution, that's why in Larkin also you find that simplicity of language. He has used the language of the society, okay, or language of the people who lived around him. He encouraged Larkin, he means Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy encouraged Larkin to use his poetry to examine the reality of his own life. Okay, just as Thomas Hardy has presented the Wessex region of his times at the end of the 19th century, in the same manner during the second half of the 20th century, Philip Larkin has presented the realistic picture of the post-war modern man's life, and that makes him a movement poet. Another important feature of movement poetry is the use of traditional meter, which we find in Larkin's poetry. Okay, he has followed the 19th century poets, the 18th century poets as far as writing is concerned, but as far as subject matter is concerned, he is a postmodern poet. So postmodern themes or subject matter are presented in a traditional style. Okay, like if you read this poem, Obeyed is a poem written in traditional iambic pentameter lines. Okay, now iambic pentameter, it's a common traditional meter which is popular among the 16th century poets. Okay, the poem follows a strict rhyme scheme of A B A B C C D E E D. So here you find this. You read this, the first line of this poem. The poem begins with this iambic pentameter. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Here the words in pink are stressed. So unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stress. Okay, weak and strong, weak and strong, weak and strong, weak and strong. This is how 5 iams are written, presented in this one line. Ian Hamilton, an important critic, has said that supremely among the recent poets, Larkin was able to accommodate a talking voice to the requirements of strict meter and tight rhymes. Okay, so according to this critique, Hamilton, his poetry has strict meters and tight rhymes, and he had a faultless ear for the possibilities of iambic line. Okay, so that makes him a movement poet, the use of traditional meters. And the last important feature which makes him a movement poet is pessimism. Okay. Larkin was much influenced by pessimistic novels of Thomas Hardy. I told you in the beginning, okay, and that's why this pessimism is found in his poetry. Andrew Motion has commented that Larkin has often been regarded as a hopeless, inflexible pessimist. Okay, so sorrow is hovering around in most of his poems. Okay. Whether he's talking on religion, on society, on government, he has written poems on all these topics. There you find his pessimism in his poems. Okay, if you examine this poem, church going, here he has expressed the dark side about church and religion. The poem has depicted the decline of the religious faith among the people. People in the postmodern era, people have stopped going to the church. Okay, people have lost faith from the religion. Okay, and when the poet enters the church, Larkin looks around himself and describes everything that he sees. Okay, the fading flowers which had been placed there on Sunday, okay, the Bible and everything, but all these things have been described by Larkin in this poem, church going, in a pessimistic manner, and he releases a message from this. With this poem, he wants to convey a message to the people that the future of this churches seem to be very pessimistic. Okay, this church will be converted into museum. Why? Because nobody is going to visit the church in future. So this pessimistic attitude has been presented by Philip Larkin. So all in all, we come to the conclusion of this discussion, and we must say that he was one of the leaders of the movement poetry of the 1950s because of his simple and clear style, colloquial language, okay, no mysticism and no ambiguity, no too many figures of speech. His focus on realism and pessimism and traditional rhyming pattern and meters, these all things combine together to make Philip Larkin as an important modernist, anti-modernist poet and an important movement poet. I hope here this video is going to be helpful to you. Please do let me know if you really like the video. Thank you for watching. Thank you.